The British Empire once ruled a quarter of the earth. Its money, the pound sterling, was the heart of global trade for over 100 years. But in just 11 days, that power vanished. This did not happen because of a lost war or a violent revolution. It happened because the United States used financial leverage as a weapon. In 1956, Britain was no longer the giant empire it used to be. However, the nation was still acting like one. For decades, Britain had controlled many of the most important trade routes on the planet. One of the most critical was the Suez Canal in Egypt. This canal was a vital shortcut for oil shipments coming from the Middle East to Europe. When Egypt's leader nationalized the canal, meaning Egypt took full control of it, Britain and France panicked. They feared losing their influence and their access to oil. Secretly, the governments of Britain, France, and Israel made a deal. They agreed to invade Egypt and take the canal back by force. This led to what we now call the Suez Crisis. Militarily, the invasion went well at first. British forces were not being defeated on the battlefield. They were winning the fight for the canal. But while the soldiers were succeeding, the nation's finances were failing. History often points to this as Prime Minister Anthony Eden's great blunder. The usual story is that Eden misjudged the situation, assumed the United States would support Britain, and acted recklessly in secret. While Eden did miscalculate American support, that is only the surface layer. Britain did not withdraw because its army was losing or because Egypt defeated them. The invasion was not impossible to complete. Britain withdrew because it ran out of financial oxygen. Behind the scenes, the British economy in 1956 was fragile. The nation still carried huge debts from Second World War. Its currency, the pound, was weak and relied heavily on foreign reserves and emergency loans to stay stable. The United States opposed the invasion, not just for moral reasons, but because Washington feared the move would destabilize the global order during the Cold War. To stop the war, the US used financial pressure instead of troops. Washington refused to support the British pound and blocked Britain from getting a vital IMF emergency loan. As investors panicked and began selling their pounds, Britain's cash reserves drained at an alarming speed. Britain faced a stark choice: keep fighting in Egypt or save its currency and economy. It was not a real choice. Britain pulled out because if it did not, the pound would collapse, taking the entire economy with it. Suez did not cause Britain's decline, it revealed it. It showed that Britain no longer controlled its own financial fate and that its empire no longer paid for itself. Most people imagine power as a collection of armies, ships, and territory. But Suez showed that financial power mattered equally, if not more. The United States did not fire a shot, send troops, or invade Britain. It simply made its ultimatum cold and clear. In effect, the message was, withdraw troops from Egypt immediately, or the United States will stop supporting your currency. That ended the war in days. Britain, the master of the seas, surrendered. The nation did not yield to an army, but to its own debt. It was a moment of clarity for the world. Britain was no longer the superpower it claimed to be. Britain had been losing its economic foundation for decades. 1956 was simply the year the world was forced to notice. Today, the United States appears to be following a strikingly similar path. The nation carries massive debt while its domestic factories continue to close. There is a common belief that American power is permanent, yet history suggests otherwise. History has a rhythm. By 2026, the same mathematical problems that broke the British pound are projected to converge on the US dollar. In this video, we will examine the facts and the numbers to see how Britain made its final mistake and why the United States is on track to repeat it. To understand how an empire falls, one must first understand how it stays on top. In the 1800s, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. This functioned like a global wallet. If a merchant in Brazil wanted to buy tea from China, the transaction was conducted in British pounds. If a bank in Europe wanted to save wealth, it was saved in pounds. This gave Britain what economists call exorbitant privilege. Because the world required pounds, Britain could print money to fund a massive global navy. The government could borrow at very low interest rates. It could spend more than it earned because the rest of the world was willing to hold British debt in exchange for goods. This mirrors the position the United States has held since 1944. However, in the late 1800s, the underlying reality began to shift. American factories were becoming more efficient. The United States was leading the world in new inventions like electricity and the assembly line. By the early 1870s, by some estimates, America had already become a larger industrial power than Britain. Yet, for 60 more years, the British pound remained the primary currency of trade. This was due to a force called inertia. Inertia is like a heavy wheel. Once it starts spinning, it is difficult to stop. All the world's banks and contracts were already set up to use pounds, making it a major hassle to switch to the dollar. British leaders mistook this convenience for permanent power. They believed that because the world used the pound, the world would always trust it. This was the first major mistake. They believed the nation was special even as its economic engine began to slow down. First World War was a turning point. The conflict was incredibly expensive, forcing Britain to borrow massive sums from American banks. By 1918, the world's richest country had become one of its biggest debtors. Despite this, British leaders sought to pretend nothing had changed. In 1925, Winston Churchill made a decision that would prove disastrous. He put Britain back on the gold standard, a system where money is locked to the price of gold. He chose to lock the pound at its high, pre-war price. Churchill wanted the pound to look strong, but the British economy was no longer strong enough to support that price. To maintain the value, the government had to keep interest rates very high, which made it difficult for domestic businesses to grow. The results were severely damaging. High interest rates made British goods like coal and ships too expensive for foreign buyers. Exports dropped, and unemployment rose. In 1926, millions of workers went on strike across the nation. The government had prioritized the prestige of a strong currency over the economic health of its own citizens. The United States currently faces a similar tension. A strong dollar allows for cheap imports and maintains financial influence, but it also makes it difficult for American factories to compete globally. The nation is essentially trading its industrial jobs for the appearance of financial power. For an empire to endure, it must remain productive. In the mid-1800s, Britain was known as the workshop of the world, but by the 1920s, British factories were aging. Innovation slowed because leaders believed captive colonial markets would always buy British goods, regardless of quality or price. Meanwhile, the United States and Germany were building the future: automobiles, chemicals, and advanced machinery. In recent decades, the United States has experienced a similar shift. Millions of manufacturing jobs have been moved offshore. The economy has transitioned into a service economy, where the nation manages money and develops software while other countries, primarily China, manufacture physical products. The consequences of this shift are now visible. The US military has acknowledged serious supply chain dependencies, including components sourced from China. The nation cannot reliably supply its own specialized medicine or refine key minerals without foreign supply chains. History shows that a service economy faces extreme risks during a crisis. When the pound crashed, the British realized they could not maintain their standard of living on reputation alone. Today, the United States appears to be caught in the same trap. By the 1930s, global faith in Britain was fading. In 1931, the nation was forced to abandon the gold standard, and the pound's value dropped by 30% almost overnight. To prevent a total collapse, Britain consolidated the sterling area, tying much of its empire to the pound. Members held their reserves in sterling and conducted much of their trade within the system. It was an attempt to use the empire to keep the currency alive. The United States does not have colonies in the traditional sense, but it has the petrodollar. In the 1970s, the US reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia. The United States provided military protection, and in exchange, the Saudis agreed to sell their oil only in US dollars. Because every country requires oil, every country was forced to hold dollars. This system serves as a pillar of American power. It creates a guaranteed demand that allows the government to print money to fund its deficits. However, just as the colonies eventually left the British system, the oil-producing world is now moving toward diversification. Saudi Arabia has signaled openness to selling oil in other currencies, such as the Chinese yuan. Other nations are building new payment systems to trade without using US banks. When the world no longer must use dollars to function, the trillions of dollars held overseas could begin to return to the American market. This shift could cause domestic prices to rise significantly, marking the potential end of the petrodollar era. Every superpower faces a mathematical trap called the Triffin dilemma. To provide the world with a reserve currency, a nation must send out more money than it takes in. This requires running constant trade deficits, buying more from the world than is sold to it. Eventually, these deficits create so much debt that the world begins to doubt the nation's ability to pay it back. Britain hit this wall in the 1940s. Its debt had grown to 250% of its entire economy. The United States is approaching that same wall. National debt is now approximately 125% of the economy, and the cost of the interest on that debt is rising rapidly. For years, the debt was ignored because interest rates were at record lows. Now that rates have increased, the interest trap has snapped shut. The US government is currently borrowing money just to pay the interest on previous loans. This cycle historically leads to a loss of confidence from creditors. 2026 is projected to be a year of critical convergence. If current policies remain unchanged, three major financial factors will collide. Number one, the interest milestone. The US is expected to spend over $1 trillion a year on interest. Interest payments exceeded the entire national defense budget already in 2024. Number 2. Persistent deficits. Although the US has averted a short-term fiscal cliff, it continues to run high deficits. The Congressional Budget Office projects a $1.7 trillion deficit for fiscal year 2026. Number 3. The debt rollover. Much of the debt issued at low rates during 2020 and 2021 is coming due. To pay it back, the government must issue new debt at much higher interest rates, which will put further upward pressure on interest costs and the overall budget. Britain believed the world would always need the pound, but they were proven wrong. Today, there is a belief that the US dollar is the only viable option. However, as history shows, global actors are already building the alternatives. The Suez Crisis was not caused by a sudden disappearance of money, but by a loss of trust. When Britain invaded Egypt, its leaders assumed the United States would provide support. Instead, President Eisenhower used financial leverage to end the conflict in a matter of days. He demonstrated to the world that Britain was no longer in control of its own fate. An American Suez moment could take several forms. It could be a geopolitical conflict where the US attempts to use its banking system as a weapon, only to find that other nations have already migrated to new systems. Or it could be a failed treasury auction, a day when the government tries to borrow money, and the global market demands a much higher interest rate than the nation can afford. In such a scenario, the Federal Reserve might be forced to print more money to cover the gap, potentially leading to a currency decline similar to what Britain experienced. History suggests that empires often rot from the inside before they collapse from the outside. In the 1950s, Britain's domestic infrastructure was in a state of decay. Nevertheless, the government continued to spend vast sums on military bases in distant lands. Today, the United States maintains approximately 750 military bases in 80 countries. Meanwhile, domestic infrastructure is consistently graded poorly by experts. Education scores are declining. Britain maintained the appearance of power until the moment its creditors decided the risk was too great to ignore. When the pound lost its status, the impact was felt in every British household. By 1976, Britain was forced to seek a bailout from the IMF. Prices for food and fuel rose sharply, while wages stagnated. The late 1970s, culminating in the Winter of Discontent in 1978 and 1979, were marked by industrial unrest, power outages, and a decline in the standard of living. If the US dollar loses its position as the world's primary money, the effects will be widespread. Personal savings and retirement accounts would lose global purchasing power. The cost of everyday goods, most of which are imported, could rise sharply, potentially doubling in some sectors. Interest rates on homes and cars would become much more expensive as the nation's risk profile changes. The British Empire did not fall because of one specific war. It fell because of a series of choices. Leaders chose to spend more than the nation earned. They chose to prioritize prestige over industrial productivity. They chose to ignore the clear warning signs. The United States appears to be navigating those same choices today. 2026 serves as a warning because the mathematical trends are reaching a point of convergence. Currently, the system appears stable due to the force of inertia, but the foundation is under increasing pressure. The path forward requires an understanding of these historical patterns. History shows that math eventually catches up with every empire.